Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and certainly I want to thank those that were part of the Millennial Roundtable yesterday. We're going to focus today on some economic issues for just a few minutes, a couple of issues in the news, some real concerns that maybe the FDA, even though they're probably moving faster than any time in history, still are delaying some very important treatments for the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll get into that. A little bit of a conversation on Russia and China, whether or not it is a possibility of some kind of military confrontation, not because they're strong, but actually because they're weak. And so those are some articles we've posted on the website. And that will be probably what we'll try to cover in the first hour. If we don't get to those tomorrow, of course, is our weekend edition. Penedexter will be back with us, and Jeremy Dice will be with us as well. Let me just say, as a program note, next hour we will have John Dickson with us. He has a new book called Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. We will talk about some of the dark chapters in the history of the church, but also try to give that a more honest appraisal than to say what your incoming and returning college students are getting right now, if they study Western civilization at all. And most of the time, they don't even teach those courses anymore at a lot of the major universities. But if they do, the only time Christianity gets mentioned is the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, and those are very sad stories, but sometimes those stories aren't even told accurately, so we're going to learn from him in a little bit of church history this next hour. But let's get into one topic that sometimes causes a yawn, but it shouldn't, because it affects you. It might affect a piece of legislation before the United States Congress, and that is the fact that the Federal Reserve met and, as a result, made some statements about what they're going to do. Now, I was on a television program earlier today in which at one point the guest, a host actually, was asking me a question about this idea, in which he said, I remember in an economics class my professor said the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a pretty important person. I said, well, we've had people on this program, Point of View, that said that he's the most important person ever, or she, when Janet Yellen was there. And so again, this is important to recognize that you may not pay a lot of attention to the Federal Reserve, but for just a few minutes, let me do so. And that is the Federal Reserve actually yesterday said that it's going to maybe ease up a little bit on their way in which they have been essentially printing money, buying treasuries. I won't get into all those details in just a moment. They'll be still buying $60 billion of bonds each month, but they're going to try to taper off in that regard. And so that's called tapering. Now, the reaction sometimes to that is when they begin to taper, it's as if you're driving a car, they put their foot on the brake instead of the accelerator. Sort of, they're putting their foot on the brake and the accelerator at the same time, if you can believe that. I know those of you that have cars don't want to do that, but I'm just trying to help you understand. They're still buying these bonds. They're still having, quote, to print money to buy those bonds because they're creating money out of thin air. And so, but they're slowing the process down, so eventually they won't be buying them any longer. Well, that has some implications. Implication number one is, if you've been depending on the stock market to keep going up, usually the stock market goes up and down and up and down. It's just gone straight up. And that's because it's close to the money printer. And so as a result, you've just seen a tremendous appreciation of the stocks. But even with this announcement, if you've been paying attention, yes, you can look at the S&P 500. It looks like it's going up, but a number of these other stocks, I've heard some people say like momentum stocks, are just dropping precipitously. Now, I'm not going to try to say that I'm a certified financial planner. I'm going to let you figure that out, talk to people that know a lot more about it. But first of all, it suggests that they recognize how much of a problem this issue of inflation has become, and yet at the same time really can't raise the interest rates, although they did hint at possibly doing that. That's the way, you might remember, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, did that, because under Jimmy Carter, inflation was running away. By the time Ronald Reagan got to his midterm, it was doing pretty well. So there are some ways in the past to have dealt with that, but that's not going to happen now. And there's a very good reason. You don't have to accept my numbers. I would encourage you right now, if you're near a computer, go to usdebtclock.org. What you will notice if you look at this is we have a national debt of $29 trillion, almost getting to $30 trillion. And the problem with it is that we are spending $6.8 trillion, but we're only bringing in $4 trillion. If you do your math, that means that $2.8 trillion is a deficit, and that has to be made up. And so how do they make it up? Well, they have to borrow money, but since nobody seems to be buying a lot of those treasuries and those bonds, we buy them essentially through the Federal Reserve. And you might say, well, then one of the ways to keep this inflation from getting any worse, well, that would be, I guess, we could just put the brakes on even harder. But the way to do that would be to raise the interest rates. And again, if you look at the U.S. debt clock and go down to the left-hand corner, the amount of interest being paid every year is $3.4 trillion. If you raise the interest rates, guess what? You owe more money, not less. Okay, that's kind of economics 101. You can look at the debt clock all day and just get really depressed. So we won't talk any more about that. But I do want to put up a chart. You've heard the old phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. For those of you that have access to a computer, you will see that I'm posting a chart right now. And it's one that I've created by, first of all, going to our good friends at the Federal Reserve. And there's a red line here, which stands for the gross domestic product. And then there's a blue line that talks about all of our debt. If you go back to a very key date in economic history, and we do talk about this in my booklet, A Biblical Point of View on Money, back in 1971, we went off the gold standard. And so from about 1971 on, you begin to see a greater and greater gap between our debt and our product. If you think about it this way, the red line represents all of the production that you and I and everybody does. But the amount that's being spent is the gap, and that gap is larger and larger and larger. And I wanted you to see the graph simply so that you could begin to understand that that's why we are facing the issue we have. And if you're looking to blame somebody, what you'll notice is this graph goes up. Doesn't matter whether we had a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether we had a Republican-controlled Congress or a Democratic-controlled Congress. It is fair to say maybe a little less under a Republican-controlled Congress, but that's actually looking for more than really is there. And it's a reminder of why we find ourselves in this unbelievable situation. So if you want to blame Joe Biden, you want to blame Donald Trump, you want to blame Barack Obama, knock yourself out. When we come back from the break, though, I might just mention our little booklet on money is a reminder of the fact that we need to be good stewards. And that's why I'm covering this for just a few more minutes to help you think about this. We'll also talk about our booklet on debt. The best thing you can do as we get into 2022 is to get out of debt. I think you should earn all you can. I think you should give all you can. And certainly we're going to talk about the importance of supporting various ministries. But at the same time, the Federal Reserve made an announcement yesterday. I'm sure it was greeted by a collective yawn, but I'm trying to give you a prediction about what I think's going to happen in 2022. And after all, it's your money, it's your family, and it's your future. So we'll continue talking about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
University professors in the humanities and social sciences have been publishing open letters for years, but the latest one comes from some of the top scientists in the country warning about the assault on math in our schools. In previous commentaries, I've talked about woke math and woke science. It is sometimes easy to dismiss such bizarre statements by leftist critics, but this letter focuses on recent attempts to eliminate standardized testing and lower standards in math to give the appearance that achievement gaps don't exist. Their focus is on the California Department of Education's math framework that encourages math teachers to take a justice-oriented perspective. They are concerned that such programs will reduce the availability of advanced mathematical courses to middle schoolers and beginning high schoolers and thus discourage students from taking calculus. The signers are from some of the top universities and are likely left of center politically, but they are deeply concerned about trendy and shallow courses instead of necessary focus on foundational mathematical skills. The lowering or even the elimination of mathematical standards would certainly damage America's global competitiveness. They remind us that the mathematical courses and disciplines are centuries old and arguably even more critical for today's challenges than in the Sputnik era. America cannot afford to dumb down education in important fields like civics and history, but our technological future would be devastated by a generation of future scientists and engineers who know little about the mathematical tools necessary for technological progress and innovation. Let's hope educators are listening. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just for a few more minutes talk about finances. And again, we're going to move on to some other topics because we have quite a list of topics I wanted to bring to you today. But I wanted you to at least be able to think through what is happening. And as I mentioned before, we do have this booklet, which I'm glad to make available to any of you. We've sent it out already to many of you that are donors. It's A Biblical View on Money. First of all, it gives you a little bit of a history of money, talks about some of the attributes of money, gives you a little bit of history of what we talked about. What is the Federal Reserve? Where did it come from? Is it even a federal agency? All the rest. It has a section there on inflation and then a whole set of biblical principles. Also have one, of course, on debt. And that's an important issue because we recognize that in Proverbs 22:7, it really talks about the fact that the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender, or probably a better translation, a slave to the lender. And you don't have to have a degree in economics. You don't have to be a certified financial planner to know that the best thing you could do right now for you and your family is, if you're in debt, get out of debt. The best thing this government could do is it stop running up our national debt on the backs of our children and grandchildren. But a minute ago, I posted that chart. Let me put it up there again because I think some of you said, oh, I didn't know you're going to be showing charts today. Let me get on my computer. But even if you don't have a computer, let me just mention that Karen was nice enough to put this on the Point of View Radio Talk Show Facebook page. Now, you can probably find something like this, but what I did was actually go to the Federal Reserve, already gives you to the all sectors debt securities and loans, and then it allows you to add a graph. So what I did was add a second one, which is the red one for the gross domestic product. And so the gap between the amount we're making and the amount we're spending, you can see is going up much faster. Matter of fact, it went up much faster in 2020. And you can also see there's a slight dip. One of the few times you see a significant dip in the gross domestic product. You see a little of that in 2008 with the housing issue, but then a more significant one in 2020. But you can see this is the gap between what we make and what we spend. And if you lived in a culture, or maybe let's just take your own household, where maybe you make $30,000 a year, but you're spending $60,000 a year, your argument would be, well, I've got to do something. You put it on your credit card. Well, printing money is kind of the federal government's credit card. So let me just for just a minute now talk about the other implications of that. And our good friend Gary Bauer put it this way. He said America got more bad news on the economy because wholesale prices rose last month at a record pace. They jumped 0.8% last month, and they're up 9.6% over the past year. Which brings me to my second graph. And this one is what's called the Consumer Price Index. Now, the Consumer Price Index, as you can see on this graph, actually has been relatively low. It jumps around a little bit. And then you come into the last couple of months, and it just almost goes vertical. This one says 6.2%. Some say it's now 6.8%. And that's what's called the Consumer Price Index. What Gary Bauer is quoting from is what many people also refer to as the Producer Price Index, which is even higher at 9.6. Okay, a lot of big numbers. What does that mean? It means that the prices are going to keep going up, because if it costs more this month to produce goods and services, what happens? When they're then on sale, say in January, the prices are going to go up to reflect that. So anybody that thinks that we've sort of reached our peak in terms of inflation, guess again. One last thing I mention, and I know I'm sounding like I'm a bearer of bad news, but I just want to tell you the truth. Anybody that has looked at the Consumer Price Index, what we have on our screen right now, recognizes when you say it's 6.2, 6.8%, whatever number you want to use, that graph says 6.2, you have to understand that if we measured the Consumer Price Index today, the way we measured it in 1980, it would be closer to 15%. So we are in sort of uncharted territory. And so my final point before we move on is Gary Bauer points out that when you start seeing record prices for inflation, either Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index, wholesale prices, whatever you want to look at, he says this should be the final nail in the coffin for President Biden's Build Back Better Act, which should be called Make America Worse Act, he says, of course, like that. He says this massive spending spree is something that has given us and put us in the middle of what looks like out of control inflation. And so I think a wise and discerning Christian, wanting to be a good steward of the resources that an individual has, would certainly want to make sure that they would get out of debt. They would expect that there's going to be some economic uncertainty. And that's why we want to encourage you to listen to this program and hopefully support it, because I just hate to tell you, but most of these graphs, most of these charts, most of the things we're talking about, you're not going to find in too many other sources. And we want you to be using the resources God has placed in your hands in an effective way. And we want you to help your families. And also, as we were talking about, even on a television program I was on today, not only should we make sure that we are the best and model citizens and handle money well as Christians, maybe some of us, as we talked about, should think about running for office and tell those individuals that have been spending money so flagrantly that maybe it's time to give them a pink slip and get somebody else that wants to have some kind of economic sanity in our federal government. So, another point to make, but let me mention now the second article. I won't talk a lot about this, but you may remember about a year ago that we had this African-American NASCAR driver, Bubba Wallace, and when he was at Talladega, saw what was a pull-down rope for his garage, and it looked like a noose. And so he made the statement that this was an intentional racist act against him. There was an investigation. Of course, there was an outpouring of support for him because it, for a moment, seemed like it. But there was a question in the back of many people's minds, and that is, don't we have lots of cameras there at Talladega? Can't we see whether or not that rope was put up there in the last 24 hours, because nobody knew which particular bay in the garage he was going to get? And so the FBI looked at the video and said, no, that's actually been there a lot longer than that. And they had no idea what it was him. As a matter of fact, a lot of people looking at it said, yeah, you could maybe say that looks like a noose, but it really just looks like a tied rope so you can pull down the garage. But nevertheless, you thought that issue was over. Well, maybe not. Right now you have this Fistful of Steel, The Rise of Bubba Wallace, which is an ESPN story. And in the midst of the story, which I think, talk about bad timing, less than a week after Jussie Smollett was convicted of staging a fake crime, now they have all kind of rekindling all the story again. And the reason I gave this to you is because in addition to the fact that this sort of just rekindles this idea that maybe it was a racist act, and it was not. Maybe it was directed at Bubba Wallace. No, it was not. It had been there for a long time. You then have some of the quotes from, I don't know, from him, from his sister, and a number of others denying the investigation and once again kind of rekindling some of the concerns that we certainly are always concerned about. We have real crimes sometimes that take place, but they aren't helped when we have a rash, as we've talked about and documented on this program, lots and lots of fake hate crimes, and in other cases where things which are obviously not a noose are then discredited and then resurrected once again. So I wanted you to read this article. I think Isaac Shore does a good job of helping you see some of the quotes, some of the back and forth, and the fact that once again we see some of these stories that have almost a leg of their own that maybe don't deserve the kind of attention right now they're getting, even in this latest documentary. Let's take a break, but when we come back, we get into a couple of other issues because there are many other stories I've posted for you today. But if you go to our website, one of the things you'll notice is that we have a picture of candles. It says light a candle, and we recognize, and you perhaps have received an email from me saying that, if you've ever been in a pitch dark room and you light a candle, it lightens everything. And it's a reminder that in this dark world that we find ourselves in, we need to go as much as possible out lighting lamps. And so one of the things we are encouraging you to do is to help us continue light those lamps, help us continue to help you light some lamps in those areas of influence where you are. And so if you go to the website today, you will notice that we have an opportunity for you to donate between now and year end. But I thought I would announce today that we already have a match on the table. And now you might say, well, why don't you announce that in 2 weeks? Well, because the match isn't huge, and I know some of you say, I'd really like to have my gift to Point of View match dollar for dollar. So the match is there right now, and certainly it is available to match your particular gift, but I won't guarantee that it'll be around there on December 30th or 31st. So I do know some of you like to procrastinate, wait to the last moment to help put us over the top. But I thought I might mention we've got a match on the table right now, and if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate that. Let's take a break. I've got a lot of other issues in the news to talk about, and we'll talk about those right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me, if I can, talk about our third article, Deadly Delays. And the way to illustrate this is to give you a word I suspect you've never heard. It's called nestering. Now, what in the world is that? Well, if you want to go back into the archives, I wrote about that in 2013, but that was a long time ago. And nestering is a term used sometimes inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and it came from a man by the name of John Nestor, Dr. John Nestor. Now, Dr. John Nestor works at the FDA, or at least he did back then. I don't know if he's retired, but he really gained some prominence when he actually would write sometimes, and he would just tick people off, but he wrote one time in particular in the Washington Post saying that the reason that he wants all of us to obey the speed limit is the reason why he gets in the left lane there in the Washington, D.C. area and puts it on cruise control for 55 miles an hour. And the a number of letters to the editor, because he said, we want to be safe, so I'm going to get in the left lane. I'm going to put it on cruise control at 55 miles an hour. Think about where you are right now, and think if that happened in your community. I mean, you would be really, and some of these people were just livid with him. Well, the point they made is this individual represents what they think is a big problem with the FDA, and that is they want to be able to be assured that every drug or every pharmaceutical is 100% safe. Now, of course, we haven't done that with the vaccines, but now we're talking about something else. We're talking about some of these pharmaceuticals that actually are used in the treatment of people that have contracted COVID-19. So John Stossel did a piece on it, and I have actually made available to you this two-page article that kind of goes into it. And he points out that, first of all, in blind test, Pfizer's Paxlovid, that's how you pronounce it, Paxlovid, I checked it out. Paxlovid was found to reduce the risk of hospitalization and death by 89%. Matter of fact, it was so effective that Pfizer was advised to stop the test. Why is that? Well, it turns out that Michael Cannon, who he interviews as Director of Health Policy at Cato Institute, said they halted the clinical trials. Why? They decided it would be unethical not to give the drug to people in the control group. So think about this. If it's considered to be unethical to deny the people in the control group to have the drug, you would think that we would probably conclude that it would be unethical to deny the American public that drug. And you would be wrong, because as he points out, and I'm now quoting from Michael Cannon, who's in the John Stossel piece, if the FDA is following its current practice, it will be a matter of months. Now, he points out, given the fact that some of these pharmaceuticals take 10 years to be approved, okay, a matter of months, well, it's better, but nobody's going to consider that Operation Warp Speed. And so what Mike Cannon actually argues is we're still losing thousands of lives unnecessarily. Let's just say right now, you know somebody that has COVID-19. They're in the hospital, and they say, well, I would like to get Paxlovid because it is produced by Pfizer, and the FDA says, sorry, just haven't actually gone through all of the clinical trials. Actually, they have now technically, but we haven't done all the paperwork, so you'll just have to manage it on your own. This one has, again, a record number of successes. The risk of hospitalization and death dropped 89% in the clinical trials. Lest you think that's the only one, let's go to the United Kingdom right now, and they have actually, in the UK, actually approved what's called Molnupiravir, and this is one from Merck, which is a coronavirus antiviral pill, and in tests, it seemed to cut hospitalizations by 30%. So you can get it in the UK, in the United Kingdom. You can't even try it in America because the FDA said more input is necessary. Now, again, the question that you have to always ask yourself is, are people that might be terminal willing to risk getting an unproven anti-cancer drug? And I think the answer is yes. Are individuals that find themselves with COVID-19 in very significant respiratory distress willing to try a particular treatment that hasn't been totally approved by the FDA? And I think the answer again would be yes. And so the argument that John Stossel makes in this piece, as you go to the second page, is, look, the FDA regulators don't want to kill people, but they do have an incentive to work slowly. If they approve a drug that hurts someone, well, they get horrible publicity. They might get fired. First of all, I'm not sure how many people at the FDA would get fired for that, but okay, let's look at that. But it brings me back to my favorite word from 2013, nestering. Because when you have people like Dr. John Nestor and others, they want to go out of their way to make sure that a drug is 100% safe. And I don't think you can ever make that kind of claim. And so when people ultimately die from the delayed approval, well, no bureaucrat gets in trouble. But if some contraindication or some problem surface because of a pharmaceutical, well, then people certainly are going to be criticized, and maybe some people will get fired. And so you can see the problem. There is all the incentive in the world to go slow, to check, to recheck, to check again, and to finally, maybe with all sorts of disclaimers. Have you ever looked at some of the bottles of drugs where they have all the contraindications and all the rest so that they can do that? And so the goal here is to never even possibly let an unsafe drug on the market. And so even if years and years of delay cost many lives, I'm not sure there's an easy answer to it, but I do believe that we are seeing right now that there are some particular treatments out there that even the mainstream media and even mainstream medicine agree are effective. If you want to extend that, and you know only so well some of the other treatments that have been vilified, criticized, and prevented from being applied, you can see one of the issues that we are facing right now in terms of the vaccines and the possible treatment for the pandemic. So I wanted to post that. I recognize that you're always weighing risks, but this idea that we would have zero risks, I wish we lived in a world like that. But as Christians, we recognize we live in a fallen world. And so here is a very good piece by our friend John Stossel. You can watch the video or you can read the article. Maybe pass it around, post it on your Facebook page, and get some people thinking about what kind of influence we should have in the future in terms of the FDA trying to save lives. One of the other ones I want to post for you to read, it's our fourth article, is an interesting piece by Andrew Mikta. I've quoted him before. I really know very little about him, but every time I read him, I really appreciate him. I know he's in Germany, so probably getting him on the program might be a little more difficult. But his article that you can read in its entirety is that we really are risking a confrontation between the United States and China. Matter of fact, he says it's probably greater than it's been in decades. But the argument he makes is just completely the opposite of what everybody else is saying. And that is, he has to believe that the reason we have this possibility of a confrontation is due to the decline of these countries rather than the rise of these powers. The rising threat of a high-intensity state of war, he says, is in some respects growing and driven by the growing conviction by both those in Russia and those in China that their power disadvantage relative to the United States and its allies will worsen unless they move soon, making victory increasingly unattainable. So rather than the argument that, well, China is beating their chests and crossing their swords and wanting a confrontation to prove how strong they are, His argument, and I think it makes some sense, is actually just the opposite, that they recognize that this might be the best time to strike. And he argues that part of that may be due to the fact that our military has been really geared up for counterterrorism rather than confronting a major power like Russia or China. Also, the domestic conditions because of COVID-19 have put us in a weaker position. And then just some of the internal pressures that take place in China and Russia. And so he says that oftentimes wars are started because of miscalculations based on unsound intelligence estimates and sometimes just underestimating the enemy. But his argument is, I think, worth some consideration, that we may find ourselves in a more dangerous time simply because Russia and China feel that they may be losing their grip on certain international opportunities and feel that if they don't act soon, they will never be able to be successful, whether it's to move into Ukraine or to move into Taiwan. Fascinating piece. Wanted you to know about it. It's our fourth article on the website. We have more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that next hour we're going to have John Dickson with us. Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. We're going to look at some of the positives, but a lot of the negatives, but try to at least put that in some kind of context in a way that sadly isn't usually given in university classrooms or even from various atheists that just want to say that religion is the problem in the world. And again, just as we've tried to talk about so often, where would this world be without Christianity? Where would this world be without the teachings of Jesus? I think we know the answer to that. But just before I get to my fifth article in just a minute, I thought I'd pick up just a couple little odds and ends. And that is, I want you to be aware of the fact that we have seen, as a lot of the talk shows have talked about, that the January 6th committee, which has been doing some investigation, actually admitted the other day to actually altering the text message between Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan. This was done during a presentation by Representative Adam Schiff. This is not the first time. It's not the second time. It's not even the third time. This is an individual that tends to oftentimes play fast and loose with the facts. So, again, the only person I suspect that is going to be held in contempt will be Mark Meadows, because he does not want to appear after providing thousands of documents. Will there be any kind of repercussion for Adam Schiff? I doubt it. And the best way to prove that is, if you haven't seen this, the individual who actually was a senior FBI lawyer, Kevin Kleinsmith, who was found guilty of forgery. If you might remember the Trump-Russia probe, in which he actually forged a document and altered it. Actually, even worse than the one by Adam Schiff the other day. He was just the other day restored to good standing status in the District of Columbia Bar Association. If you are keeping track of this, it's a good illustration of something we've talked about many times before. We have a situation in which we have two different levels of law. One set of laws that apply to you and me, and a different set of laws, apparently, that apply to some of these political elites. So will there be any repercussions for Kevin Kleinsmith? They actually put him in a good standing status even before he completed his probationary sentence. Adam Schiff, how many times has he not told the truth? And I guess you know the story there. So we'll move on. The other thing I want to mention real quickly is, if you look at your calendar here, you're going to know something very interesting, that it is the 16th of December. And if you've been paying attention, there was a deadline yesterday, December 15th, and that was a deadline to be vaccinated, fully vaccinated. Well, we now have at least 4,000 U.S. soldiers who have not been vaccinated with any one of these vaccines. And so now we'll have to see what unfolds. We'll probably talk about some of that tomorrow when we get into some of the conversation with Jeremy Dice and where we're going in that regard. And then, of course, in addition to the federal mandates, you've had some various companies that have done that. And again, I just thought I would mention in passing that there was quite a hostile, high volume, I guess you could say, interchange between Senator Ted Cruz and the CEO of United Airlines, Scott Kerby, because many of the other airlines have decided not to enforce a vaccine mandate, but in this particular case, it was there. And that illustrates, again, the ongoing debate about vaccine mandates. And the one that is now coming down is the argument that you aren't fully vaccinated if you've had the two vaccinations, the first and second. You're not considered fully vaccinated unless you have the booster. And I've been making a short list here as well. Let's take some easy ones here. Metropolitan Opera said that for you to actually play and to sing, you actually have to get the booster. A number of universities, that would be Georgetown University, New York University, a couple of colleges, Minnesota, already require boosters for you to even be on campus. The NFL is requiring coaches and staff now to get booster shots by December 27th. So there we go. And again, those are just some things I wanted you to know we've been following. We may get into some of those conversations tomorrow. But my fifth and final article is one that comes from Charles Cook, who we love to quote from time to time. And he starts out with kind of a joke. He says, the strangest thing happened to a friend of mine on the night of his 18th 18th birthday. There he was lying in bed after an evening of celebration when all of a sudden a strong and insistent man broke in through the window of his apartment, kidnapped him, and forced him to take out $70,000 in student loans. Alarmingly, the saga didn't end there. Despite my friend's urgent protestations, this man personally escorted him to his college matriculation, sat with him while he chose his classes, and then spent 4 years ensuring that he would not only attend them but benefited from them as much as was practically possible. And here's the worst part. Despite having put my friend through this rotten ordeal, this dastardly man has steadfastly refused to transfer responsibility for the loans to the good old American taxpayer. Can you believe it? Well, no, of course. He says, I'm joking. But he said, I'm afraid this is how the people who demand that the federal government pay off these student debts are beginning to sound to the average American. And so, as we've talked about before in our booklet on debt, we have, of course, record national debt, record consumer debt, and, of course, record student loan debt. And he points out the fact that what you're starting to see is a justification for why you, as the taxpayers, need to pay off these debts. Because he says they'll say, well, if I didn't have to pay off my loans, then I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, which would have benefited the macroeconomic effect. Or if I didn't have to repay my loans, I could get on the property ladder. If I didn't have my loans to pay, I would be less anxious about money. And Charles Cook has a little bit of fun saying, really anyone can do this. If I didn't have to pay my mortgage, I'd have more money to spend on consumer products, which would have a beneficial macroeconomic effect. Ipso facto, the federal government should pay my mortgage. If my plumber didn't have to make payments on his F-150 he uses to transport his equipment, he would be more readily able to buy a home. Ipso facto, the federal government should pay off his truck. And so you can get on. He says, loan givers say that's different. He says, is it really? And then ends with a story we've told before, because the current representative in New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, complained about the fact that she has $17,000 in student loan debt because she went to graduate school, and she says this is unacceptable. But he says, unacceptable? First of all the people to say that, as a member of Congress, she actually makes $175,000 per year, has been widely reported as doing quite well, and just recently bought herself a Tesla. So just don't have a lot of sympathy for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So if you hear somebody, and you're going to hear some members of Congress saying, we just need to get this student loan debt off the backs of these students, first of all, you might want to read my booklet on a biblical view on debt. But second of all, maybe read the article by Charles Cook. Just before we end this first hour, let me mention again that I sent out an email to you yesterday, and it shows a picture of a candle. And I love it. As you keep watching it, more and more candles are lit. And sometimes it only takes one candle to spread to another candle to another. If you've ever been to a candlelight service, and all of us will probably go to one of those on Christmas Eve, you can see that. And so we recognize how we can be a source of news, information, commentary, motivation, and action for you. And if you value what we do here at Point of View, I would certainly encourage you to support this ministry. As I've said before, as we come to year end, there are various churches, Christian organizations, even radio stations that are trying to make their budget for the next year, so consider them as well. But I hope we'll be part of your giving as well. And you go to the website, pointofview.net. We have that link where you can click on the button that says Donate Now. Also, of course, the email has a link there. And as I mentioned, we have a match right now. It works. I'm hoping it will last to the end of the month, but it may not. So maybe it's a good time to make that phone call or click on that button right now. Let's take a break. We'll talk about Bullies and Saints next hour, right after this.
Have you ever been in a pitch black room when someone lit a candle? The change from darkness to visibility is instant. But what's even better is when that one small flame is used to light other candles. Before long, a room that was completely dark is radiating with light. That's what happens when you share the truth. Just like that small flame, your light is contagious, and it's needed in America today. Did you know that most Americans still identify as Christians? But here's the scary part. Only 9% of those people actually understand biblical teachings according to findings by researchers. You could say that America is the dark room. Will you be the person to light a candle? Here's how you can spread that light even farther. When you give to Point of View, you'll equip millions of others with the tools they need to stand for truth. And any gift before December 31st will be matched up to $75,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. In our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This year we're going to spend some time looking at church history. And again, as we've pointed out so many times before, there are good stories and bad stories. There are some very dark chapters in church history. We understand that. The sad reality is sometimes when you go off to university, all you hear are those, if indeed you even take a class, and they're hardly even offered anymore in a lot of universities here in the United States, on Western civilization. It seems like all you hear about is the Inquisition, the Crusades, maybe the Salem witch trials, a few other things, slavery, and the rest. And so we really want to get an honest look at this. And so this book that we are talking about this hour, Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. You can think about some of the other interviews we've done with Dr. Rodney Stark, for example, in which we talked about the triumph of Christianity. More recently, we had Dr. Tom Holland on his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. He doesn't necessarily even looking at that from a Christian point of view, but certainly honest with the facts. We've had, of course, Dr. Paul Copan on talking about how the new atheists sometimes say we would be better without religion, and religion actually makes good people do bad things. So how do we make some sense of this? And that's why I'm just so thrilled that we can bring to the microphone Dr. John Dickson. He is an author, speaker, historian, media presenter, author of more than 20 books, perhaps one that you might be aware of, For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Imagined. He also teaches a course on historical Jesus at the University of Sydney in Australia. He's a visiting academic in the Faculty of Classics at Oxford University and a distinguished fellow and senior lecturer in public Christianity at Ridley College in Melbourne. So, Dr. Dickson, a delight to have you on the program today.
Kerby, it's lovely to chat to you as well.
I might just mention your book is actually endorsed by a lot of people we've interviewed on this program. I mentioned Tom Holland, a very nice endorsement of your book, John Lennox, Peter Williams has been both by phone and in studio, Philip Jenkins, and a number of others. So this is a book that is published by Zondervan. It is a little more academic book, so I know that some might be able to find it in their local bookstore, but we also have a link so that you can get it either in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. And so those are some great resources for you there as well. I think we actually have the one on hardback listed there, and that's the one I have. But start out with this whole idea of better off without religion, because you, like I, have sometimes gone to various presentations. I've done debates. I've moderated debates on is religion good, or creation evolution, or the authority of the Bible, or a variety of others. And you start out by telling a story that I think illustrates exactly why you felt to write the book.
Yes, we were involved in a very public debate here in Australia that was broadcast on our equivalent of NPR. And it was the title of the debate was "We'd be better off without religion," and obviously I was supporting the nay side, saying we wouldn't be better off.
Yes.
And we had some really good speakers, including John Lennox, on our side, and there were 2,000 people in the room where it happened, and they took a poll of what people's opinion was before the debate, and then one after the debate, and we spectacularly lost. This group thought that we would indeed be better off without religion. And I came away thinking Well, this is such a common perspective in Sydney, Australia, and I've travelled enough outside of Australia to know that it's pretty common outside. I thought, well, I need to think about this. I need to teach about it and eventually write about it. But it took me a good 10 years to think through, read through, and feel confident that I had something to say that would not annoy our doubting friends. There are some great things out there for Christians. I wanted to write something that you could give your skeptical, grumpy uncle at Christmas time, who thinks Christianity is only damaged. And this, I hope, will give them second thought.
Well, and again, that's one of the reasons why we had Tom Holland on. Usually we have Christian authors, not exclusively, but here's an individual that's on the outside looking in and saying this. And of course, so we've mentioned Rodney Stark, and I can go through the long list of the positives, but I thought we might as well get right into it. And one of those is the Crusades. Now, when I wrote my first book, and this is years ago, on Islam, I felt I should have a chapter on the Crusades, if for no other reason than almost every time you run into somebody who says, well, look at all the damage Christianity's done. I said, well, can you give me some examples so we at least have a conversation? They'll say the Crusades, and I'll say, okay, which one of the 7? Long pause. They don't know. I mean, that's their line. But let's be very honest. The Crusades are a very dark part of church history, and you begin by helping us understand how dark indeed they were. So explain that, if you might.
Yeah, well, I start the book sort of in the middle of Christian history because this is when they begin. The Crusades begin, 1096, and once I've dealt with the Crusades, I then wind back to the beginning and crawl through each century. But you're right, people see the Crusades as proof that Christianity starts all the wars of history. And, that's an exaggeration. And I agree with those who point out that the Crusades were a response to Islamic aggression. All of that is clear. The problem is the Crusades had a theological scandal, if you like, and a moral scandal. The theological scandal was, the official theology was that if you killed the Muslim fighters during this crusade, you were earning your forgiveness of sin. And what a horrible thing to teach. The moral problem is, even if we can argue the First Crusade was a just war, a response to Islamic aggression, and I tend to believe that's true, the way the crusade was conducted was despicable.
Well said. And yes. It's not the justification, it's the carrying out.
Yeah, exactly. So you can make a just war unjust by slaughtering Jewish communities along the Rhine on the way to the Holy Land, which is what they did. You can turn a just war into an unjust war by killing women and children, as well as combatants, as they did on July 15, 1099, when they broke through Jerusalem's walls and slaughtered everyone. And we're happy about it. This is the terrible scandal of the Crusade.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we certainly wanted to start there because it's in the first couple of chapters, but we do want to talk about, of course, the persecution of Christians, the idea of religious liberty, a topic we will address tomorrow in our weekend edition with one of the lawyers that deals with religious liberty, and some of the other aspects of the birth of charity and some of those early parts, because this, first of all, is an important part of church history, and it's something you need to know. Many of you know my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. Another book I might recommend is Church History in Plain Language, but another one, of course, is this book, which goes into such detail, by John Dickson, Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history, published by Zondervan. And if you'd like to find out about a copy of it, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find information there. If you'd like to know more about him, we certainly do want you to know about his work and research as well. But let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
University professors in the humanities and social sciences have been publishing open letters for years, but the latest one comes from some of the top scientists in the country warning about the assault on math in our schools. In previous commentaries, I've talked about woke math and woke science. It is sometimes easy to dismiss such bizarre statements by leftist critics, but this letter focuses on recent attempts to eliminate standardized testing and lower standards in math to give the appearance that achievement gaps don't exist. Their focus is on the California Department of Education's math framework that encourages math teachers to take a justice-oriented perspective. They are concerned that such programs will reduce the availability of advanced mathematical courses to middle schoolers and beginning high schoolers, and thus discourage students from taking calculus. The signers are from some of the top universities and are likely left of center politically, but they are deeply concerned about trendy and shallow courses instead of necessary focus on foundational mathematical skills. The lowering or even the elimination of mathematical standards would certainly damage America's global competitiveness. They remind us that the mathematical courses and disciplines are centuries old and arguably even more critical for today's challenges than in the Sputnik era. America cannot afford to dumb down education in important fields like civics and history, but our technological future would be devastated by a generation of future scientists and engineers who know little about the mathematical tools necessary for technological progress and innovation. Let's hope educators are listening. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Fascinating book, and one that I certainly do commend to you. It is published by Zondervan, and it is written by Dr. John Dickson. Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. And I do want to obviously get into some of those time frames, but also know that when you did your documentary, some people said, well, why are you doing this? You're sort of airing the dirty laundry of Christianity. Now, that's not exactly how they said it, I know, but the bottom line is that I think we have to have an honest look at church history, just as in America we have to have an honest look of American history, and I've recognized that it was worth doing whole weeks of programs on the Indian Wars and slavery. It's important to understand that there have been some very bright spots in church history, but there's some very dark chapters too, aren't there?
There are, and it was Jesus who said, take the plank out of your eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly. And so Christians ought to be in the business of noticing the plank in our eye instead of the speck in someone else's eye. So I think there's a theological reason, but there's also a practical reason why it's important to be honest, and that's that the truth is already out. You know, enough people who have critical motives have highlighted, as you said at the outset, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and so on. And that's all people know. So if you come out simply defending the church instead of conceding what has gone wrong, people won't feel it's a trustworthy account. And I wanted to offer a trustworthy account that does deal with the dark spots and then points people toward the beautiful tune, as I put it, the beautiful tune of Jesus, that, you know, love your enemies, and something he not only taught but demonstrated by taking himself to the cross and giving himself for us. for his enemies.
Very good. Well, again, I know this is unfair for somebody that has the depth that you have, but in order to maybe cover a lot, can you maybe help us understand some of those first centuries, because you call them good losers, because that gets us into persecution, but then also this idea of religious liberty and charity, because many of the things that we take for granted today in the Western world didn't come from Greece and Rome. These came ultimately from those individuals who were taking seriously the words of Jesus, and even those facing persecution were getting comfort from 1st and 2nd Peter, from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Matter of fact, even now, persecuted Christians in so many parts of the world are getting comfort from some of those scripture verses that actually were written during a time in which the disciples and the followers of Jesus were really running for their lives because they were in the midst of that persecution.
Yes, well, they believed the gospel was about God entering the world and giving himself on a cross out of love. And so that animated those first Christians. And the reason I call them good losers is not because they really lost. They won, in fact. But they won through losing. And what I mean is they accepted persecution as coming with the territory of the gospel. They believed that they were the death and resurrected people and that the Lord would vindicate them. And that enabled them to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies, to pray for those who persecuted them. And that stunned the Romans around them. And the Romans couldn't work out why people would be adopting such a strange strategy. So that's the good news. But in the midst of all of that persecution, which at various times in the first 300 years was intense, they continued their charitable works. And again, they believed God had given himself for the world, so they should do the same by establishing charities and eventually hospitals that were available for believers and unbelievers alike. That's very important to make clear. And Greece and Rome didn't have charities that were available. I mean, sure, emperors would open the storehouses during times of famine for citizens, not for non-citizens, and non-citizens were the majority. But Christians decided that they should use their resources to care for those around them. And it had a massive influence on people looking on, wondering, why do those people love like that? Why do they love their own and us, unbelievers? And it's because they had a particular view of God. And this is not theology or apologetics. This is something that great classicists in the world today would agree. The Christians had a completely different view of what God was like, and that changed what believers were to do in the world. As I put it through the book, there was a beautiful tune that Jesus wrote, and Christians sang along. They sang in tune for much of that first three centuries.
Well, again, part of that, as you quote from one professor at the University of Oxford, Christians are taught that God loves them absolutely, that on this basis they can trust in God, that they can love God, and because they are given such an abundance of love, they can afford to love one another with enormous, unreserved generosity. A little later, beginning to talk about the fact that they were notorious for looking after the widows, the poor, the orphans, the people in society that were slung out into the streets. And if you go back and look at what Rome was like, Rodney Stark has kind of reminded us of that. If you were sick, you'd be thrown out in the street. If you had a pandemic like we just had these last 2 years, they would just get rid of you. And so with a threat to their own lives, they would go and minister to those individuals, sometimes risking their own death. They would then, in Nero's circus, be willing to die, and the pagans look on and go, I wouldn't die for our belief in God. What do these people have that we don't have? And though we take for granted today compassion and charity, sometimes we even use the misplaced compassion to criticize Christianity, but we fail to, even in this world, realize how much of that came from Christianity.
Well, I think that's undeniable, and people who know their Greek and Roman history know that things like slavery and warfare and torture were not Christian inventions. Christians did that from time to time, but these things were universal. What wasn't universal in Greece and Rome were charities and hospitals and the concept of religious freedom. These things came into the Western tradition entirely through what we call the Judeo-Christian view. More simply, it's just the beautiful tune of Jesus that when Christians sing along, it transforms the world.
Well, again, you have a chapter in which you talk about Trinity, charity, First Hospitals. So at a very time when you're starting to see charity, you're seeing hospitals and a variety of other things, you're also seeing slavery. So we're back to one of the negatives. And what about this? Because the argument has always been from our new atheist friends is that, well, you have a Bible that actually endorses slavery. I have trouble finding that. If anything, in the book of Jude and other passages, I see just the opposite. But we sometimes, at the very time you see some really positive things like compassion, charity, hospitals, even universities, you also have the issue of slavery, anti-Semitism. Can you talk about that dark part of that for just a few minutes?
Yeah, well, I mean, slavery was universal, and it seems that this is one of those things where Christians were partially blind. It was a blind spot in most Christians. I guess, people 200 years from now may look back on us and our materialism in the Western Church and wonder, were we really Christians? So it's easy to judge the past. But the thing I would say about the early Christians is that they were the only ones trying to moderate slavery. Like, yes, I lament they didn't get rid of slavery, but they did try and moderate it, and they did it in a number of ways. They insisted that any slave who was a Christian who owned, any masters who owned slaves, were to treat them kindly and as family. The church raised funds, huge charitable funds, to free slaves as well. No one was freeing more slaves than the church, even in these early centuries. And on several occasions, so far as we know, Christians were actually completely freeing slaves. Augustine oversaw a massive slave-freeing raid over in Hippo, where he was the bishop. The Christians after church one day went down to the slave ship in port and busted more than 100 slaves out. We have really good evidence of that.
Yes.
We know over in Cappadocia there was a preacher preaching against slavery. We know in the 7th century there were Christian bishops freeing slaves all around Europe. So they were doing something. The lamentable point is that they weren't doing everything.
Yes. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, since you mentioned Augustine, let's get into Just War. That's chapter 12, and then as soon as we get to that, we also ultimately get into this idea of a Christian jihad, which takes us back, of course, to some of those, and then we'll get into prophets and hypocrites and the Inquisition. We certainly will cover as much as we possibly can, and if you'd like to read this, or if you think this might be a good book to give to a skeptic wondering whether or not Christianity is really good for Western civilization, I think you could make the case that the fact that we have Western civilization, it had Judeo-Christian roots as well as Greek and Roman, but you can see once we've lost Christianity, we look a lot more like Rome than we ever have before. Let's take a break, though. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. John Dickson right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with John Dickson. Again, the book is entitled Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. A very significant book, but again, a surprisingly low price for some of these hardback books. Sometimes there's sticker shock when I order some of these books, but still, we love books. And so I wanted you to know about that. In addition, we also have a link to johndickson.org. Don't have to even remember that if you're driving right now. You have a link. First of all, it has his bio, some of his books. He has a podcast, Undeceptions, Undeceived to Free from Deception, Illusion, or Error. I think you would really benefit from that. There's a contact point. Perhaps you'd like to have him come and speak or just like to know more about his documentaries and much more. We do have a link to that website. And again, it is johndickson.org. You should be able to find it on our website, and we encourage you to maybe get a copy of this book as well. Let's, if we can, John, talk about just war. You mentioned Augustine, and then, of course, we can look at the contrast of that to the idea of, you might call Christian jihad, the Knights of Christ. This whole idea of warfare wasn't an issue originally because you didn't really have Christians in the military. Sometimes they were being persecuted. But by the time you get to Augustine, you're really getting to, well, what would be a reasonable or a moral perspective on war? And even to this day, we sometimes cite some of the arguments for a just war. So can you take us through a little bit of that history and why that's so important even here in the 21st century?
Yeah, well, by the year 400, there were enough Christians throughout the Roman world that Roman leaders wanted Christian advice about conducting all sorts of policies, including war, and they turned to Augustine. St. Augustine, one of the biggest brains of the ancient church. And he had to do some fancy thinking. What does it mean to follow the crucified Lord and go to war? And he adopted this just war principle reluctantly. He was no warmonger. He adopted it reluctantly, but in the end he said that a war can be right when the goal is to establish peace, when it's self-defense, when restraint is used in hostilities, only a sort of proportional response, and when you conduct the war in such a way that your enemies, when they're defeated, don't resent you because they know you've respected their humanity, and prisoners of war are to be preserved. They aren't to be executed. Now, all of those seem like what we do today, and there's a reason for that. This influenced our world. This was not how Romans thought you should conduct war.
Right.
They thought you could conduct war just to expand the empire. That was perfectly fine. Killing prisoners of war was fine. But Augustine argued otherwise, and rulers began to take his advice. And so we have this just war tradition, which still today is a feature of Western warfare.
Again, I've talked about, just cause, a just intention, last resort, formal declaration, limited objectives. Those are on the way to war. And then you have two others that apply in the midst of war, proportionate means and non-combatant immunity. Some we've talked about briefly before, especially back in the days when we were talking about Desert Storm and Desert Shield and war on terrorism and all the rest. But again, we owe an incredible debt of gratitude to Augustine. But if you can, maybe you jump ahead to another chapter, Christian jihad, because that gets us into everything from forced conversions to, of course, this in 1095, 1096 of Crusades. So where did Christians, if they had this as a foundation, go wrong in that particular way?
Well, 3.5 centuries after Augustine, Christians were expanding throughout Europe. And Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the greatest ruler of Europe in the 8th century, middle of the 8th century, wanted to expand his territory, and he did conduct what scholars have described as a Christian jihad. He converted the Saxons at the point of the sword. And this is a terrible tale of a man who proclaimed Jesus as Lord, but offered the Saxons up in the northern parts of what we call Germany now, baptism or the sword. And quite literally, if they didn't get baptized, he would slaughter them. And so many of them did get baptized. And of course, they only did it as a cover because they didn't want the sword. And when they continued their pagan ways, Charlemagne would vindictively go and slaughter them. Now, there is a bright spot in this century, if you can believe it, because one of Charlemagne's key advisors was a theologian called Alcuin. He was a Yorkshireman, an Englishman, Alcuin of York. And Alcuin wrote 2 letters that we have preserved, begging Charlemagne and his court to stop trying to convert people with the sword, because the only way you can convert people is with the persuasion and the sweet milk that the apostles preached, only through the gospel. So he sounds like one of us, Kerby. And indeed he was. And we know that Charlemagne changed his policy as a result of the influence of Alcuin. So we can praise the Lord for that.
Well, and again, let's, if we can, move to kind of the idea of the Knights of Christ and the move from a just war to a holy war. Because how did that develop? Because, again, part of it is Charlemagne, but there is also just sort of a different kind of philosophy that began to be developed. And so you have the Knights of Templar and the Crusades. Can you kind of fill in those gaps? We sort of talked about it briefly, but I think now we're to that point again in terms of the history.
Well, by the time we get to the 9th and 10th centuries, Christians are really interacting with the warrior classes, the pagan warrior classes of Europe. One of the untold stories of this whole period is that the church was so desperate to convert the warrior peoples that they couldn't beat, that they actually began to adopt the language of Christ as a knight and the apostles as his war band.
Yes.
And they began to portray Jesus and Christianity as just a good version of the warrior class in order to missionize these people in Europe. And it's a really strange feature of Christianity in this period. They were so desperate to convert these warrior tribes that were unruly and very powerful that they became very much like them. And so by the 10th and 11th century, there's a real happy embrace of war, I'm afraid to say, by Christians. And so when the Christians in the 11th century get the call from the Eastern Christian Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, to come and help us because the Muslims are overtaking the land, everything was primed in Europe to go and help and to do it as holy war, not just war, but as something that the Lord would bless you in doing. He would forgive your sins as a result of conducting this warfare. And it's terrible theology.
It certainly was. One of the things I love about your book is here is a historian who also quotes from Monty Python. And it's obviously brings us to the Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, which dates you and me, if nothing else. But we are to that point now where we move from war to heresy trials. We have about 2 minutes before we take a break. But again, we have a series of inquisitions. And again, based upon this idea of forced conversion, and also the punishing of anyone that would stray from what is actually portrayed and proclaimed as orthodoxy.
The Inquisitions is such a strange part of the story because no one is going to accept what the Inquisitors did. That's absolutely true. But until the 1990s, people didn't actually have access to the original documents of the trials and so on. And so a lot of what we grew up knowing about the Inquisition was propaganda. And we now know that the Inquisitions, over its 350 years, killed about 5,000 to 6,000 people, or 18 a year, which is terrible, of course, but it pales into insignificance compared to the secular courts, which were killing many hundreds every year. We also know that people in the secular court in Spain often begged to go to the Inquisition courts because the Inquisition courts were known to give better prisons and food to prisoners and have better legal procedures.
Yes.
So, yes, it's terrible. But in the day, you actually thought people thought the Inquisitions were the more just court.
That, again, is just amazing. And again, I appreciate the work that you've done. Of course, Rodney Stark's been on the program talking about whether it's the witch trials or a number of others. But when we come back from the break, obviously there's another issue. We have, of course, then the Protestant Reformation, which is certainly a positive. But then almost within a short period of time, we have the wars of religion, the religious wars, and what that means there as well. And even though that sometimes is not mentioned as often, sometimes in some of the universities, it's something else to address, and that's why we are doing that today, talking about Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. John Dickson has done a great job with this book, and we are so thrilled he could spend an hour with us. We'll take a break, come back with him to finish off right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. John Dickson, Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. And I thought we'd talk about the Reformation, obviously, that I think is a highlight in American history and in English history and, of course, in European history and the rest. But the bottom line is that almost after we began to have that freedom and the development of various Protestant religions and various ideas, you also then had the wars of religion. So help us through that, because, again, you have both the good and the bad and the ugly all coming together at once, don't you?
You do. The most violent war in European history was the so-called 30 Years' War, and that's 1618 to 1648. And proportionally, more people died in that war in Europe than in the First and Second World Wars. So it loomed large for centuries in Europe. And at one level, it was religious in the sense that pretty much everyone was religious. And there's no doubt that Protestants fought Catholics, Catholics fought Protestants. But the more recent research in European universities and British universities has revealed that actually it's wrong to call this a war of religion, because there's too much evidence now that sometimes Catholic princes would gang up with Protestant princes to attack a Catholic prince over the border. And so it can't be about religion if you've got Catholic armies joining Protestant armies to fight Catholics, and sometimes Catholics and Protestants fighting Protestants. And it really seems that what happened as a result of the Reformation is that people began to see that the old Christendom, the Holy Roman Empire as it was called, isn't the only way of organizing Europe, that each individual state could have its own religion, have its own denomination. And it was this spirit of we can rule our own territory. Now, what we would now think of as different countries, that concept really was a Reformation breakthrough, and people fought over it. But they didn't fight simply along Protestant and Catholic lines. They fought for their territory, and sometimes, as I said, the Catholic prince would engage with a Protestant prince to help them, get rid of the French, for example, who were a more powerful army. And the Protestant was happy to help the Catholics because they believed Europe should be ruled as city-states, not as one conglomerate.
And there's sometimes when I've said that there are times when people use religion as a pretext, but that wasn't really the cause. And I think when you talk about the 30 Years' War and some of these other skirmishes and all of that, that had a lot to do with it. But it was also used, I think, as a justification for something you talk about in terms of the Enlightenment and just even maybe the rejection of the idea of truth. Because the argument was, well, you keep telling us that there's truth, but is it the Catholic truth or is it the Protestant truth? That is the Lutheran truth or the Calvinist truth? That is the Anglican truth? I mean, you started having that sort of skepticism, which today we sometimes call postmodernism, but or even the Enlightenment and modernism. And so some of those, if nothing else, use the justification of these religious wars as a justification for rejecting any kind of belief in absolute truth or truth that comes from the Scriptures.
I think you're right. When there's a monolithic truth, there is no freedom. But one of the things the Reformation gave us was, no, we should be able to look at the Bible, come to our own mind, and call that true without consequence, without punishment. And so that freedom to think for yourself was very much a Reformation breakthrough. But of course, the extension of that, once you say, I don't believe in any of these religions, is to say, well, there's no truth. We go from the Protestants saying, no, we should have the freedom to discover what we know to be true. That moves to people who say, well, you know what? There's no truth at all. And that's a very sad split and a kind of a perversion of what the Reformation spirit was about.
You end by talking about the log in the eye of all of us. And you quote from Steven Pinker. I've done some commentaries on his book, Enlightenment Now. As a matter of fact, sitting there on my shelf right in front of me. And so in some respects, you have this sort of humanistic, evolutionary idea that we're getting better and better, but that's really not the case. And really what I think you're trying to do is help us understand that we have hypocrisy in every century. We we have places where indeed individuals who claim to be Christians, and maybe they are, I don't know, that I sometimes make a distinction between professors and possessors. Some people will profess to be a Christian, but it's really doubtful whether they were a true Christian, or versus those who possess a commitment to Jesus Christ. But the bottom line is what we find is that we better be careful not to overjudge any other century, given the fact that we probably have some logs in our own eyes even in this century. Is that fair?
It is fair. I think one of the key ideas historians learn is that we ourselves are probably like the people of the past. You know, here we are with 2020 vision looking back on people in the 9th century or whatever, and we criticize them. But we should really stop and say that human nature hasn't changed.
Nope.
People 200 years from now may well look back on us and judge us. So I think we need to be a little kinder to each other, admit that we are all at fault in the present, in the past, and in the future, and ultimately go back to that beautiful tune of Christ on the cross giving himself for us. That's our only hope.
So good. You end by talking about the fact that violence has been a universal part of human story. The demand to love one's enemy is not. And again, if you think about this, hospitals and charity and schools are very different than what we had seen before. Bullies are common, saints are not. And I think if nothing else, this is a reminder that we need to live godly lives and live like saints, not like bullies, and to learn the lessons from the past to apply them in the future. So just an outstanding book. And Dr. John Dickson, let me mention again that we have information about the book. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link there so you can get it in hardback and Kindle. And if you find yourself saying, I'd really like to correspond with him, maybe even see if he'd come to speak to the States sometime or other places, or like to know more about his podcast, we have all of that at johndickson.org. And if you want to find all that, it's easy because it's at our website, pointofview.net. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a future opportunity if you would be open to it.
I certainly would, Kerby. That was a great conversation. Thank you.
Well, we are done with that conversation today, unfortunately. We could go a lot longer. 550-page book. Oh, we've just skimmed the surfaces, but we gave you a chance to learn a little bit more about our history and some of those very dark chapters as well. So, again, we are going to take a break. Just before we do so, I've encouraged you to light a candle. You know, we all need to be living godly lives. We need to light a candle. We want to provide you with resources so you can have an impact in your community, because I'll never be able to light a candle in your community except when sometimes I come and visit you as we travel. You have the responsibility to light that candle in your community, and we want to provide you with the resources necessary to make a difference. Again, as I've mentioned, we are coming to year end. But I decided, let's put the match on there right now. Some of you might say, I really don't want to wait till December 29th, 30th, or 31st. And I think that would be wise because we might run out of the match. I don't know, but this would be a good time. And so here it is, just the middle of December. If you'd like to make a gift, it will be matched dollar for dollar. All that on our website, pointofview.net. As always, I want to thank Andrew for our engineering and Steve for our producing. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Have you ever been in a pitch black room when someone lit a candle? The change from darkness to visibility is instant, but what's even better is when that one small flame is used to light other candles. Before long, a room that was completely dark is radiating with light. That's what happens when you share the truth. Just like that small flame, your light is contagious, and it's needed in America today. Did you know that most Americans still identify as Christians? But here's the scary part. Only 9% of those people actually understand biblical teachings, according to findings by researchers. You could say that America is the dark room. Will you be the person to light a candle? Here's how you can spread that light even farther. When you give to Point of View, you'll equip millions of others with the tools they need to stand for truth. And any gift before December 31st will be matched up to $75,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.